The air in Louisiana hung thick and warm that spring evening, the kind of humid stillness that seemed to hold every sound in suspension. The sun had long dipped below the pine trees beyond the fence, leaving the U.S. Army's Camp Ruston washed in a soft amber glow. Inside the perimeter of barbed wire and wooden guard towers, the women moved quietly between the barracks, their gray uniforms already damp from the evening heat. They were German prisoners, nurses, clerks, and auxiliary staff from the shattered edges of the Third Reich, captured when their medical units surrendered in France in late. Most of them had spent weeks on the road, shuffled between makeshift holding centers and interrogation sites before being shipped across the Atlantic. For many, the journey had been terrifying. Rumors whispered among the prisoners told of retribution, of American hatred for the Nazis, of endless hard labor and humiliation. They had expected cruelty, not comfort. So when the first days at Camp Ruston passed quietly, when they were given soap, clean water, and even a small mirror, it felt like a strange kind of disorientation. Liesel Weber, a young nurse from Hamburg, could hardly comprehend the stillness. For 2 years she had lived beneath sirens and bombs. She had pulled survivors from burning rubble, held the hands of children dying from smoke, and written letters for soldiers who would never see home again. At 23 her hands had learned to tremble only after the danger passed. Now standing near the window of Barrack 6, she watched the guards change shifts under the floodlights. The Americans walked with a casualness that confused her. No shouts, no barking orders. They even laughed. It was almost indecent, she thought, to laugh when Europe lay in ashes. That night something unusual happened. A few guards entered the recreation hall carrying a wooden box. They plugged it into an outlet near the wall, adjusted the crank, and a faint crackling sound emerged. Liesel leaned closer to listen. The machine, the guards called it a gramophone, began to play. Soft brass swelled through the air, followed by a lilting rhythm unlike anything she had heard since before the war. It was an American waltz, slow and smooth, the kind of music that used to drift from dance halls along the Ulster River before the bombings had turned them to dust. At first no one moved. The women froze, uncertain whether this was allowed or some kind of test. One of the guards smiled awkwardly and said something in English that few understood. Then another, older woman, a former schoolteacher from Bremen, laughed nervously and took her friend's hand. They began to sway, clumsy and hesitant. Someone clapped. Then someone else. Within minutes the entire hall was alive with movement. A few guards joined in, careful not to overstep, while the rest leaned against the walls, smiling shyly. Liesel stood watching, torn between disbelief and longing. Her body remembered the steps her mother had taught her years ago, during the summer of 1939, when the war was only a whisper. The room had been filled with light then, and her father had laughed as they spun to the tune of a violin. Now under the dim bulbs of the American camp, that same motion returned to her muscles like a memory breaking through the fog. She stepped forward, then hesitated, unsure if she had the right to dance when everything she loved was gone. Behind her one of the women whispered, "They're letting us dance." The words sounded fragile, as if spoken too loudly they might break the spell. The guards had stopped watching closely. Some even turned the volume higher, letting the brass and strings echo through the campyard. Outside, beyond the barbed wire, the night hummed with crickets and the faint rustle of pine needles. For a few minutes the fences seemed invisible. Liesel finally took a step forward. Her shoes were worn thin, her dress a size too large, but as she moved to the rhythm of the music, her body seemed to float. The song ended to scattered applause and laughter. Small, cautious laughter, as though everyone was afraid it might be their last chance. Then another record was placed on the turntable. This time a faster tune. Someone tapped their foot against the wooden floor. The guards clapped along. For the first time in months, maybe years, the air felt alive. Liesel's heart ached as she danced. She thought of her brother Hans, who had been conscripted into the Wehrmacht and sent east. The last letter she'd received from him was dated January 1943, written in hurried script from outside Stalingrad. He had promised to come home soon. No more letters came after that. Their mother had stopped asking. Now as the melody swirled around her, she imagined him watching her dance, her little brother who once teased her for spinning too fast. The guards didn't interfere when some of the women asked for water, or leaned against the walls to rest. They were kind but distant, careful not to touch, not to cross a line. One of them, a young man with sandy hair, noticed Liesel's hesitation and gestured politely toward the floor. "It's all right," he said in slow, careful English. "You can dance." She understood the words, though she couldn't find her voice to reply. She smiled instead, a small uncertain smile that trembled at the edges. Outside, the camp looked surreal. The wire fences glowed under the lights, their sharp edges softened by shadows. The guard towers loomed like silent sentinels, but even the men stationed there seemed to watch with quiet curiosity rather than suspicion. Somewhere beyond the pine forest lay the road to the small town of Ruston, where American families were having their own suppers, perhaps unaware that just a few miles away, women from the other side of the world were rediscovering what it meant to be human. When the music finally faded and the gramophone crackled into silence, the room was heavy with the sound of breathing. No one spoke for a moment. Then someone began humming the melody softly, keeping it alive. The guards began to leave, carrying the gramophone between them. Liesel sat down on the edge of her bunk, feeling her pulse slowly steady. Her hands still trembled slightly from the dance. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The air was thick, the barracks crowded. Around her, women whispered in half-remembered German dialects, telling each other about their homes, about fields in Bavaria, the sea near Kiel, the cobbled streets of Cologne. They spoke in the dark because it was the only way to make those places real again. Liesel listened, eyes open, tracing the cracks in the wooden ceiling with her gaze. She thought about what it meant to be here, to be treated kindly by those who were supposed to be her captors. Back home she had been taught that Americans were monsters, destroyers who wanted to wipe Germany from the map. But the man who fixed the gramophone today had smiled when one of the women thanked him. He couldn't have been older than 20. Maybe he'd never even seen combat. Maybe he didn't hate them at all. The realization unsettled her. It was easier to think of enemies as faceless. The next morning the camp routine resumed. Roll call, rations, assigned tasks. Liesel was sent to assist in the infirmary, tending to small injuries among prisoners and guards alike. The American sergeant in charge of medical supplies, a stout man with a kind face, showed her how to sterilize the equipment properly. "You did this before, huh?" he asked, nodding toward her practiced hand. She nodded once, not daring to tell him how many times she had cleaned blood from wounds that could not be saved. As days passed, the rumor of the dance night spread through the camp like wildfire. Some of the older women disapproved, whispering that it was shameful to celebrate while the fatherland lay in ruins. Others argued that it was the first time they had felt alive in years. Liesel stayed silent, caught between guilt and gratitude. Every evening she lingered by the window, half hoping to hear the faint strains of the gramophone again. When it returned a week later, the entire camp seemed to breathe differently. Music filled the air once more, this time not waltzes but swing tunes, lively and strange, with rhythms that made even the most solemn faces light up. A few guards clapped in rhythm, and someone laughed out loud, a bright, startled laugh that turned heads. It was contagious. The women began to dance again, some alone, some in pairs. Liesel found herself beside a tall, dark-haired nurse named Anneliese, who whispered, "It feels like home, doesn't it? Even if it's not." Liesel nodded, her throat tight. She thought of the river Elbe, of the way the light used to scatter on the water in summer. She thought of her mother's hands, strong and tired, kneading bread dough while listening to the radio. She thought of her father's voice reading poetry before bed. All of it was gone now, but the music, this strange foreign music, seemed to carry the ghosts gently rather than drown them. One of the guards, the same young man from before, offered a polite bow. "Miss, would you like?" he asked awkwardly, extending a hand. Liesel hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. His palm was rough, his grip careful. They moved slowly at first, his steps uncertain but kind. She noticed he kept his eyes averted, as if afraid to make her uncomfortable. It wasn't romance, it was something simpler, more human. Around them, laughter and chatter filled the room. Someone found a way to translate the lyrics of the song. Something about the moonlight and love in faraway places. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Faraway places. That's all they were now. Far away from everything that had ever been theirs. Yet for that brief time inside the low wooden walls of an American camp, distance didn't matter. The music folded it all into something bearable. Later, after lights out, Liesel returned to her bunk with sore feet and a mind too full for rest. She thought of how strange the world had become, how quickly enemies could begin to resemble ordinary people again when the guns fell silent. She wasn't sure if she should feel thankful or ashamed. Somewhere beyond the ocean, cities still smoldered, prisoners still starved, and yet here she was, fed, clothed, even allowed to dance. It didn't seem fair, but maybe fairness had died long before the war began. The gramophone, now a treasured object among the guards, would play again soon. Each night it came to life, It erased a little more of the bitterness, softened the sharp edges of memory, and every time Liesel heard the first trembling notes of a waltz echo through the barracks, her heart lifted slightly, confused but alive, waiting for the next breath of music to carry her somewhere she no longer dared to dream of returning to. 2 nights after that first evening of music, Camp Ruston was different. The rhythm of the place had changed in a way that no one could quite describe. The air still carried the same scent of pine and dust, the same mix of boiled cabbage and soap that marked every mealtime. But something beneath the routine had loosened. The prisoners moved with a quieter confidence now, talking more, smiling sometimes when the guards weren't looking. Word had spread quickly through the camp that the Americans had allowed them to dance. Allowed them, of all people, the defeated, the enemy, to listen to music again. It seemed impossible. But then again, everything since capture had been impossible. The barracks stood in orderly lines, built from rough timber that creaked with every gust of wind. During the day, the heat pressed down like a weight, but the evenings brought cool air, and with it a strange calm. The women were used to marching, to working, to obeying orders shouted in a language that brooked no questions. Now, the Americans gave orders gently, through translators or by demonstration. There were no punishments for small mistakes, no sudden shouts. It was confusing. Some prisoners whispered that this kindness was deceit, that Americans only played the role of gentlemen because their victory was complete. Others said that maybe, just maybe, the world was changing. Liesel Weber had begun to notice details she hadn't before. The way the guards carried themselves, relaxed but disciplined. The smell of cigarettes mixed with pine resin in the air. The distant laughter from the men's compound across the field. She had been assigned to light clerical work, copying medical records and helping organize supplies in the infirmary. It wasn't difficult, and she worked quietly, her thoughts often elsewhere. Each day she saw the same people. Anneliese, who had been a Luftwaffe secretary and still held herself like one, Gerda, who hummed lullabies as she cleaned, and Corporal Miller, the young American who always seemed slightly embarrassed when speaking to the German women. Miller was not like the other guards. He was from Georgia, barely 22, with a soft accent that stretched his vowels like syrup. He had enlisted after his older brother was killed in Italy, but the war had ended before he saw real combat. He carried that fact like a quiet guilt. Sometimes he would watch the prisoners working and wonder how many of them had lost brothers too. When he looked at Liesel bent over her papers with her hair tied back in a plain knot, he saw not an enemy but someone who had suffered in ways he could not imagine. That evening, the sun set early, painting the sky in streaks of violet and orange. The guards had decided to bring the gramophone again, and this time they carried it to the open yard between the barracks. They set up a small table, placed a few records beside it, and stood back as the first tune began. The music floated into the night like a ghost of another world. Glenn Miller's orchestra, bright and clean, the brass instruments gliding over the steady rhythm of the drums. The first few notes drew curious faces to the windows, then hesitant footsteps from the barracks. Within minutes, dozens of women had gathered, some clutching each other's arms, others laughing nervously as if afraid to be seen smiling. Liesel hesitated at first. She stood near the steps, her heart pounding faster than the rhythm. The night air was soft, carrying the scent of wild grass and engine oil. Corporal Miller, standing near the gramophone, caught her eye and offered a small nod, a gesture that said, "It's all right." She walked forward slowly. The music swelled. A few women began to move in time, clapping their hands lightly or swaying with small uncertain steps. A handful of guards clapped too, careful not to break the spell. The Americans watched with an odd mixture of amusement and admiration. They had never seen German prisoners like these before. They had expected coldness, pride, defiance. Instead, they found tired young women trying to remember what it felt like to live. Miller approached Liesel and said, in his halting German, "Dance?" She blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. Then, realizing his sincerity, she nodded. His steps were clumsy at first, too large, too unsure, but Liesel guided him gently, whispering, "Eins, zwei, drei," under her breath as they found their rhythm. Around them, the yard came alive. Laughter broke out as one woman tripped and another spun too fast. Someone started singing along, her voice trembling but clear. For a few moments, there was no war, no camp, no loss, only the fragile heartbeat of music under a Louisiana sky. The stars appeared slowly, scattered and cold above the tall pines. The floodlights cast long golden halos on the ground, and the shadows of dancers wove together in the dust. Liesel's dress swirled lightly with each turn, catching the faint glimmer of moonlight. Her shoes were worn, her hair pulled loose from its knot, but she felt something stirring in her chest, something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Freedom, perhaps, or something close to it. Later, when the record ended and another began, Miller said softly, "You dance good." She smiled faintly, answering in English, "Not good. Long time no dance." He laughed awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. It was a small moment, insignificant to anyone else, but for both of them it carried a weight neither could name. As the night went on, the mood shifted. The laughter grew quieter. Some women stopped dancing and sat on the ground, their eyes far away, their minds drifting to cities that no longer existed. Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, all gone. One of the older prisoners, Frau Beck, who had once been a concert pianist, began to cry quietly as she listened to the music. She had lost her husband in Stalingrad, and her 2 sons in the Allied bombings. "It's too beautiful," she whispered. "Too beautiful for us." Liesel heard her words and felt tears rise in her own eyes. She thought of the night the bombs fell on Hamburg, the sky glowing red as whole streets vanished under flame. She remembered carrying a small boy, no older than 6, whose hair had been singed by fire. His eyes had stared at her blankly, even as she pressed a wet cloth against his burned arm. That memory lived behind her eyes like a scar. And now, here she was, standing in an American camp, dancing to American music, allowed to feel something close to happiness again. The contradiction was unbearable. The next morning, the camp buzzed with talk. Some of the women joked that the Americans had gone mad. Others wondered if the officers would stop the dances once they found out. But Major Thomas Newton, the camp commander, had already made his decision. When his aide expressed concern, Newton waved him off. "Let them dance," he said firmly. "They've lost enough. If this keeps them human, we'll do it again." Newton had seen too much death to believe in punishment as justice. He had fought in North Africa, watched men bleed out on desert sand, and buried too many friends to mistake cruelty for strength. He believed that the war's real victory would come, not from conquering enemies, but from teaching them what peace looked like. His policy made some of the younger guards uneasy, but they obeyed. The next week another dance was held. This time the Americans brought lanterns, hanging them from the posts to create a makeshift ballroom. The women came prepared, some tying ribbons into their hair, others scrubbing their shoes to make them shine. Liesel found herself laughing as Annalisa complained about her dress being a disgrace to womanhood. The 2 of them helped each other straighten their collars, trying to look proper for an evening that felt like a dream borrowed from another life. When the music began, the sound seemed to carry beyond the fence, across the fields and into the night. A few local townspeople who lived near the camp claimed later that they could hear it faintly on the wind. Foreign music and foreign laughter drifting from behind the barbed wire. Some were scandalized. Others simply shook their heads. War had turned the world upside down. What was one more strange sight? Inside the camp the atmosphere grew lighter. Even those who refused to dance stood watching, smiling reluctantly as they tapped their feet. The guards stood near the edges, rifles slung loosely, chatting quietly. One of them produced a harmonica and joined in, adding a playful tune that made the women clap and cheer. The barrier between captor and captive blurred just enough for everyone to remember that they were, above all else, human. Liesel and Miller danced again, more confidently this time. He had learned to count the steps properly, though his boots were too heavy for real grace. "Back home," he said during one song, "my sister taught me this. Said I was hopeless." Liesel smiled, thinking of her own brother. "My brother said same," she replied, her accent thick but clear. They both laughed, and in that sound was something like forgiveness. But as the night wore on, the fragility of their joy showed through. For every smile there was a shadow. Every note of music carried the memory of what had been lost. A woman near the back fainted when someone mentioned the Red Cross reports from Germany. The camp doctor said she had received word that her town castle had been destroyed entirely. Liesel helped carry her to the infirmary, her hands steady even as her heart ached. When she returned to the yard, the music was still playing, but slower now, softer. She watched the others moving like ghosts under the lanterns, and she felt both part of them and apart. This place, this small island of civility, was not real. Outside the fence, millions still struggled to survive amid ruins. Inside, they were being fed, clothed, treated as people again. It was mercy, but it was also unbearable knowledge. As she walked back toward the barracks, Miller caught up to her, calling her name gently. "Miss Weber," he said. "You okay?" She nodded, forcing a smile. "Just tired," she said. He hesitated, wanting to say something more, but the words wouldn't come. They stood there in silence for a long moment before parting, the distance between them filled with everything neither could express. That night, Liesel couldn't sleep. She lay on her cot, listening to the faint hum of insects outside and the occasional whistle from the guard towers. Anneliese whispered across the dark, "Do you think they'll let us go home soon?" Liesel didn't answer. What home? She didn't even know if hers still stood. The image of her street in Hamburg, the bakery at the corner, the green shutters of her childhood window, all seemed like dreams now, erased by fire. She thought of the Americans, of how young they looked, how little hatred they carried. They treated the prisoners not as symbols of evil, but as women, as people who might still be redeemed. It confused her, but it also softened something inside her chest. She had spent years believing that the world was divided into sides of right and wrong, pure and impure. Yet here, under the strange peace of captivity, she was beginning to see shades of humanity that her country's leaders had never spoken of. Outside, the gramophone was still faintly humming, someone having forgotten to turn it off completely. The record spun in slow, lazy circles, repeating the final note over and over, a soft, endless whisper that sounded almost like breathing. Liesel closed her eyes and listened, not knowing why the sound made her want to cry. By the winter of 1945, the world beyond the fences of Camp Rustin had changed. The radio crackled with news that Germany had surrendered, that Hitler was dead, that Berlin lay in ruins. The war, the monstrous, all-consuming war, was over. Yet inside the camp, time seemed suspended, caught between relief and loss. The German women no longer marched in strict lines or carried the stiffness of soldiers. They walked slower now, their eyes softer, but their laughter, when it came, was tinged with a kind of sorrow that only those who had lost everything could understand. Letters began to arrive that summer, carried in brown canvas sacks by American postal trucks that rumbled through the gates each week. Each name called out at mail time was like the turning of a key in an invisible lock. Some names brought joy, some brought silence, and some brought collapse. Liesel Weber waited weeks before her own was called. The envelope was thin, worn at the edges, the handwriting shaky but unmistakable. Her mother's. She took it to a quiet corner behind the infirmary and opened it carefully, as if afraid it might fall apart in her hands. The paper smelled faintly of smoke. The letter was short, written in hurried German. "My dearest Liesel, we are alive, though barely. The house is gone. The river is black. I work in the ruins with neighbors. Hans did not come back. The city is full of silence. Do not worry for me. Stay alive, my child. You are all that remains. Mother." Liesel read it 3 times before she folded it neatly and pressed it against her heart. The world seemed to tilt around her. She had known, of course, everyone knew what "did not come back" meant. But to see it written in her mother's careful hand broke something inside her that had managed to stay whole until then. She didn't cry right away. Instead, she sat on the steps and stared at the pine trees beyond the fence until the light faded. Only later, when she returned to the barracks and Anneliese asked what was wrong, did the tears finally come. The Americans noticed the change in the women. After the flood of letters, the camp grew quieter. Work continued as usual, but conversations were shorter, the laughter rarer. Major Thomas Newton, walking the perimeter one evening, remarked to his aide, "They've had their world confirmed. Now they're truly prisoners, not of us but of what's left of home." His aide, a young lieutenant from Ohio, nodded solemnly. "Should we stop the dances, sir?" Newton shook his head. "No. That's the only time they forget." And so the dances continued, though with a different kind of energy. They were no longer about joy. They were about remembrance, about trying to stay human in the aftermath of everything inhuman. The gramophone, now patched with tape and scratches, played the same worn records. Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw, Benny Goodman. The tunes were cheerful, but the women moved more slowly now, their steps deliberate, like a ritual rather than a celebration. Liesel sometimes helped organize the events, setting out benches, sweeping the floor, arranging the lanterns the guards brought. She worked quietly, keeping her hands busy so her mind wouldn't wander too far. The Americans often left her in charge of small things: the infirmary supplies, the list of volunteers for the kitchen, the records of medical rations. She had proven herself reliable, steady, the kind of person others trusted without knowing why. One evening, as she was cataloging medicine bottles, Major Newton stopped by. He leaned against the doorway, removing his hat. "You've been a great help here, Miss Weber," he said. His German was passable. marked by an American rhythm. I want you to know that what you do matters. Liesel nodded, unsure what to say. Compliments felt strange in this place. He looked at the shelves, then added, I've seen enough war to last a lifetime. You remind me that it doesn't have to destroy everything. After he left, she stood for a long time staring at the shelves of medicine, at the rows of glass bottles that glowed faintly in the lamplight. The thought that an American officer could speak to her with such gentleness unsettled her. In Germany, they had been taught to see Americans as savages, loud, crude, heartless. Yet here they were, men who let their prisoners dance, who treated them with decency. The contrast gnawed at her mind. Perhaps, she thought, the lies of the war had reached deeper than anyone realized. As the year wore on, winter came even to Louisiana. The pine trees turned gray in the morning mist, and frost glittered on the fences. The women began to knit scarves from scraps of yarn sent by Red Cross parcels, laughing softly as they compared crooked stitches. It was in those quiet domestic moments that the war seemed furthest away. Liesel found a strange peace in her daily tasks, boiling water, tending small wounds, recording temperatures on neat sheets of paper. It was a fragile, borrowed peace, but it was enough. Then one day, in January 1946, something unexpected happened. The camp received a shipment of American soldiers returning from the Pacific. A few of them were recovering from injuries, and the infirmary was suddenly crowded. Liesel and the other German nurses were assigned to assist. For the first time, she treated American wounds, burns, shrapnel scars, infected cuts. The men looked at her with a mixture of surprise and discomfort, not quite knowing how to react to a German tending to them. But necessity has its own logic, and soon the unease faded into quiet cooperation. One of the soldiers, Private James Whitaker, had a deep cut along his hand. As Liesel cleaned and bandaged it, he watched her closely, then said softly, You remind me of my sister. She had the same look when she worked. Liesel glanced up, startled. Where is she asked, her accent thick but clear. His eyes lowered. Dresden, he said simply. She didn't make it. The words hit her like a slap. Dresden, her own country, her own people destroyed by the same bombers, whose uniforms these men wore. Yet there was no anger in his voice, only sadness. She finished the bandage in silence, her throat tight. When he thanked her, she nodded once, unable to speak. That night she walked outside, the cold air biting her cheeks. She stood by the fence and stared at the dark forest beyond. The war had turned everything upside down. Friends into enemies, mercy into suspicion, guilt into survival. And now, in this strange corner of America, the very people who had burned her city were teaching her how to live again. A week later, Major Newton announced that the camp would begin a new initiative, writing letters of thanks. You will be allowed to correspond with organizations that have helped you, he told them. The Red Cross, church groups. Even us if you wish. You can write what you feel. Some prisoners laughed bitterly. Others simply stared. But slowly the idea spread. Within days, dozens of women were writing. Liesel's letter was simple. To the command at Camp Ruston, you have treated us with humanity when we expected none. You have given us music, bread, and the chance to remember who we were before the war. For this, I thank you. I hope one day my country can learn the same kindness. Respectfully, Lowell Weber. When Major Newton read it, he kept it on his desk for weeks, showing it to visiting officers as proof that compassion was not wasted. This, he told them, is how you end a war. But not everyone agreed. Local newspapers began to take notice of the comforts given to German prisoners. One headline read, Enemy women living in luxury, while our boys starve in Europe. The public outrage grew quickly. Letters poured into the War Department demanding stricter treatment. Newton was summoned to explain his policies. You're feeding them, housing them, letting them dance? One colonel asked incredulously. Sir, they were Nazis. Newton's reply was simple. They were human beings before that. The controversy reached the guards too. Some grew uneasy, worried about being seen as too lenient. A few stopped attending the dances. The gramophone played less often now, the music quieter, as if aware of the world's disapproval. Still, among the women, the sense of gratitude remained. They cleaned their quarters more carefully, helped with the gardens, wrote more letters. It was their way of saying thank you, without words. In March, another shipment of mail arrived. This time the letters carried news of reconstruction, cities clearing rubble, railways reopening, schools holding classes in basements. But there were darker stories too, about hunger, Revenge killings in the chaos of occupation. For the first time, the German women realized that they might have been safer behind barbed wire than at home. One evening, while sorting medical supplies, Liesel overheard two American officers talking outside the infirmary. "You know," one said, "I think some of them don't want to leave." The other laughed. "Can you blame them? Over there it's ruins. Over here they've got food and music." Liesel pretended not to hear, but the words lodged in her mind. She didn't know whether to be ashamed or relieved. Spring brought rain. The camp's dirt paths turned to mud, and the pines dripped water like tears. The dances resumed briefly. Smaller now, almost secret. Fewer guards attended, but those who did seemed more like friends than jailers. Corporal Miller was still there, though quieter than before. One night he found Liesel sitting alone outside the infirmary, her hands clasped around a cup of coffee. "You still dance?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "Sometimes," she said. He nodded, looking toward the fence. "You'll be going home soon." The words caught her off guard. "Home?" she repeated. "If it is still there." He didn't answer. They sat in silence, the rain pattering softly on the tin roof above them. As the month passed, more prisoners were released, sent to ports for repatriation. Each departure was marked by a mixture of relief and fear. Some women cried as they boarded the buses, clutching letters, photographs, and small handmade gifts from the guards. Others stared straight ahead, unwilling to look back. Liesel stayed behind, her release delayed because of her work in the infirmary. She didn't mind. The camp had become a strange kind of home, a place where she could exist without judgment, where the worst was behind her and the future still mercifully vague. By late spring, the gramophone had nearly worn out. The records were scratched beyond repair, the needle dull, but one evening, someone managed to coax one last song from it, a faint wavering tune that rose and fell like breath. The women gathered instinctively, standing in the doorway of the recreation hall, listening. The melody carried through the open windows, across the muddy yard, up to the watchtower where a lone guard leaned on his rifle, humming along. Liesel closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond fences, beyond war. She didn't know what it would look like or who she would be in it, but she knew one thing: she would never forget the strange mercy of this place, or the music that had turned captivity into something resembling grace. The war had ended almost a year ago when the order finally came. Camp Ruston would begin the process of repatriation. The prisoners, those who had crossed an ocean to live between fences and find strange mercy in their defeat, were to be sent home. The news came on a warm April morning, announced by Major Newton himself. The women stood assembled in the yard, the air full of spring and pine, while he spoke in slow, clear English, that the translator repeated in German. "You will be returning home in the coming weeks," he said. "The war is over. You will go back to rebuild what has been broken." His voice carried across the field, steady but heavy. Many of the women lowered their eyes. Some clasped hands tightly. Others whispered small prayers. Liesel Weber stood among them, her heart thudding in her chest. Home. The word no longer meant what it once did. She imagined the ruins of Hamburg, the empty street where her mother used to hang flower pots from the balcony, the bakery that smelled of cinnamon on Sundays, the church bell that had fallen silent long before the surrender. She thought of her mother's last letter, the one she still kept folded in the pocket of her uniform. "We are alive, though barely." Those words had kept her going. Now they terrified her. To return home meant to face them, to face what remained of a life that had vanished in smoke. In the following days, the camp buzzed with nervous energy. Lists were made, names checked, papers signed. American officers moved between the offices, preparing for the transfers. The Red Cross arrived with medical supplies and guidelines for the journey. Some of the women cried openly, others stared into space as if unable to believe it. The dances stopped. The gramophone sat silent in the corner of the recreation hall, its handle rusted, its records piled like forgotten memories. Liesel worked tirelessly in the infirmary, helping prepare those who were sick for travel. She cleaned wounds, packed bandages, distributed medicine. The camp's doctor, Captain Reynolds, thanked her for her service. "You've done more good here than many who wore a uniform for the right side," he said softly. She smiled faintly, unsure how to respond. The right side? Was there even such a thing anymore? At night, the women gathered in their barracks and spoke in low voices about what awaited them. Some had received letters saying their towns were being rebuilt. Others had heard nothing at all. "What if no one's there?" whispered Annalise one evening, her eyes glistening in the lantern light. "What if there's nothing?" No one answered. They all carried that same fear, the silent dread that they would return not to homes but to ghosts. A few days before the first transport, Major Newton called Liesl to his office. He stood by the window smoking a cigarette, the faint smell of tobacco mixing with the scent of pine from outside. "You'll be on the second convoy," he said. "You've earned the right to go back as soon as possible, but we need you here a little longer to help with the sick." She nodded. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. He turned toward her and smiled faintly. "You know, Miss Weber, this camp will not be remembered in history books, but I hope you do. What happened here, it matters." She didn't know what to say, so she simply bowed her head. When she left, she saw Corporal Miller waiting outside. He had grown thinner over the months, his face more lined, his eyes tired. "You're going home soon," he said softly. "Yes," she answered. "Home." The word caught in her throat. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded photograph. "Here," he said, handing it to her. It was a picture of his family, his parents standing on a porch, his sister holding a small dog. "Keep it," he said. "So you remember there were good people too." Liesl held the picture carefully, her fingers trembling. "Danke," she whispered. He smiled a little. "You're welcome," he said. They stood in silence for a moment before he saluted her. A gesture not of command but of respect. She returned it awkwardly, tears stinging her eyes. That night the gramophone returned. No one knew whose idea it was. Perhaps it was Newton's, perhaps Miller's, or perhaps one of the women had begged for it one last time. The guards set it up in the yard, under the glow of lanterns, and for the first time in weeks, the camp filled with sound again. The record was old and scratched, but as the first notes of Moonlight Serenade drifted through the air, everyone froze. Then slowly, the women began to gather. Some laughed softly, others covered their mouths to hide the sobs rising in their throats. Liesl stood at the edge of the crowd, the music washing over her like a tide. The melody was soft, gentle, full of longing. It was the sound of everything they had lost, and everything they still dared to hope for. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to see Miller. "Dan?" he asked simply. She hesitated, then nodded. They moved slowly, the dust rising beneath their feet as the music carried them in circles. Around them, others joined, German women with American soldiers, nurses with guards, captives with captors. The floodlights painted the ground in pale gold, and above them the sky stretched wide and dark, scattered with stars. For that brief impossible moment, there were no sides, no nations, no victory or defeat. There were only people, moving together to the rhythm of forgiveness. Liesl's eyes filled with tears as they danced. She could feel the rough fabric of his uniform against her fingers, the solid warmth of his hand guiding hers. They didn't speak. There were no words left that could bridge what had been done, what had been lost, but the silence between them was not empty. It was full of understanding, full of all the things that could never be said aloud. The song ended, but no one moved. The crackling of the record filled the air, that soft whispering sound like a heartbeat fading into silence. Then slowly, someone began to clap. Another joined, and another, until the entire camp echoed with applause. Some women laughed through their tears. Others simply stood still, their faces lifted toward the sky. The next morning the first convoy departed. Buses lined up outside the gates, engines rumbling softly. The Red Cross trucks were loaded with supplies, the American flag fluttering in the breeze. The prisoners carried small bundles, letters, photographs, handmade trinkets. They were dressed neatly in donated clothes, each woman clutching the papers that would take her back across the ocean. Liesl stood beside the gate as names were called. She helped translate for those who couldn't understand the English announcements. The women climbed aboard the buses, waving through the dusty windows. Some guards waved back, others simply watched in silence. The barbed wire glinted in the sunlight, sharp and clean, as if determined to remind everyone that mercy had existed here despite its presence. When it was her turn, Liesl stepped forward slowly, her bag slung over her shoulder. She turned once, looking back at the camp, the wooden barracks, the tall pines, the watchtower where a guard stood leaning against the rail watching quietly. She saw the yard where they had danced, the small infirmary where she had spent her days, the faint outline of the recreation hall where laughter had once filled the air. It all felt impossibly far away already, fading like a photograph left too long in the sun. Corporal Miller was near the gate, overseeing the boarding. When she approached, he smiled faintly. "Safe journey, Miss Weber," he said. "Maybe we meet again someday." She wanted to answer, but her voice wouldn't come. Instead, she reached into her pocket and took out a small piece of folded paper. It was her mother's letter. She handed it to him. "Keep this," she said softly. "To remember too." He looked at it, then at her, and nodded. "I will." She stepped onto the bus and found a seat near the window. The engine growled to life. Outside, the guards stood in a line, their faces solemn. The bus lurched forward, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. As they passed through the gate, Liesl pressed her hand against the glass. Miller lifted his hand in return, his figure shrinking as the distance grew. The road wound through the Louisiana countryside, lined with trees and fields, that stretched toward the horizon. The women on the bus spoke in low voices, sharing memories, fears, hopes. Some cried softly, some sang. Liesl sat in silence, watching the world outside blur into streaks of green and gold. The fences were gone now, but the sound of the gramophone still echoed in her mind. The waltz, the laughter, the fragile sound of redemption. After 2 days of travel, they reached the port of New York. The city loomed ahead, vast and gray, its skyline rising like a promise. Ships waited in the harbor, their hulls gleaming in the sunlight. The women were led through processing lines, fingerprinted, inspected, documented. Liesl followed quietly, her mind half numb. The air smelled of salt and smoke, of oil and seaweed. At the docks, American nurses distributed sandwiches and coffee. One of them smiled at Liesl. "You'll be home soon," she said gently. Liesl thanked her, though she wasn't sure if the words were true. Home had become an idea more than a place. Still, the thought filled her with a strange warmth. When she finally boarded the ship, she climbed to the deck and stood at the rail, watching the harbor recede. The Statue of Liberty shimmered in the distance, her torch glinting in the afternoon sun. Around her, other women whispered prayers, crossed themselves, or stared silently at the sea. The engines roared, and the ship began to move. The Atlantic stretched before them, endless and gray. The journey was long, the days marked by monotony and reflection. Some of the women fell ill, seasick or feverish. Liesl helped where she could, her hand steady as always. At night she would sit on the deck and look at the stars. The ocean wind tangled her hair, the waves hissed softly below. Sometimes she thought of Miller, of the photograph he had given her, now tucked safely in her pocket. She wondered if he was still at Ruston, still guarding the empty barracks, still listening to the echoes of their laughter. The voyage lasted nearly 2 weeks. When at last they saw land gray and broken beneath a veil of mist, the deck erupted in murmurs. "Home," someone whispered. "Germany." The ship slowed as it entered the port of Bremerhaven, where British and American officers waited. The city lay in ruins, its harbor littered with wreckage. The skeletons of ships half submerged in the water. Smoke rose from distant chimneys, mingling with the fog. As Liesl stepped onto the dock, her heart clenched. The air was colder here, the sky heavier. The buildings were shattered, the streets filled with rubble. People moved like ghosts through the ruins, wrapped in rags, faces thin and gray. She clutched her small bag and walked forward, guided by Red Cross workers. Every step felt like walking deeper into a memory she had tried to forget. At a checkpoint, an officer looked over her papers and nodded. "Welcome home," he said in German. The words hit her harder than she expected. She thanked him softly and moved on. Beyond the harbor, a train waited to take them further inland. The carriages were cold and crowded. Liesl found a seat near the window and stared at the passing landscape, fields strewn with debris, towns half buried in dust. Children played among ruins, their laughter thin and sharp. Women carried buckets of water along streets with no roofs left standing. Everything was smaller, quieter, hollowed out. Hours later, as the train neared Hamburg, her pulse quickened. The station was little more than a shell of blackened stone. She stepped down onto the platform, the weight of her bag pulling at her shoulder. The air smelled of soot and rain. She walked through the streets she once knew, but they no longer knew her. Whole blocks had vanished, replaced by mounds of bricks and twisted steel. The bakery was gone. The church bell lay shattered in the dirt. When she reached what had once been her street, she stopped. Her mother's building was gone, replaced by an empty lot where weeds grew among broken foundations. She sank to her knees, pressing her hands to the cold ground. The silence was unbearable. The only sound was the wind moving through the ruins, like a whisper of ghosts. She stayed there for a long time, motionless, until a voice called her name. She turned and saw a woman, thin, wrapped in a shawl, her face pale but familiar. Liesel. The voice trembled. Liesel Weber. Her breath caught. Mother. Her mother hurried forward, tears spilling down her cheeks. They embraced tightly, wordlessly, clinging to each other in the ruins. The world around them had crumbled, but this one thing had survived. They walked home together, or what was left of home, in a makeshift shelter built from scavenged wood and tin. Her mother poured her a cup of weak tea and smiled faintly. "I told you to stay alive," she said softly. "You did." Liesel nodded, her throat too tight for words. That night, as she lay on a cot beside her mother listening to the wind outside, she thought of Camp Ruston, the music, the dances, the faces of the women, the kindness of strangers. Somewhere far away, under the same stars, she imagined the gramophone still spinning, its scratched record turning endlessly, carrying a song across the distance between war and peace.